if there's one thing we can say that's universal, well, there are probably a few things, but definitely this one fits with all of us. We all have temptations. We all have to learn how to deal with temptations. And a lot of times we have practices or traditions where it's kind of like a Band-Aid approach, where we kind of find ourselves sometimes dealing with the after effects of temptation more than the actual temptation. And that is, we realize that we've done things wrong and we go try to fix our mistakes. We all know that the best way to avoid sin is not to wait until you're doing sin to start realizing that it's sin. We've got to put the brakes on early. And we have to face the fact that we're all going to be tempted. Now, some people go to extremes. They say, well, if I'm a Christian and I'm holy and I'm devout toward God, I'll never have temptation or sin in my life. Well, that's completely false. You're going to have temptation. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how holy you are. So having temptation is not something you should beat yourself up over as if you're not holy enough, because even Jesus had temptations. And if you want to make comparisons and suggest that you can be perfect enough to avoid temptations, then you need to look at Jesus, because even he had temptation. Temptation and sin are not the same thing. One leads to the other, but they don't have to lead to the other. Temptation doesn't have to mean that we sin. And we need to be reminded of that. We also need to build our confidence that just because we're tempted does not mean we have to give in to it. But Satan works on us. And he tries to convince us through various means that, well, if you're tempted, it's no use. It's going to happen sooner or later. Or you're in the moment, you haven't even thought about it, you're blindsided by something, and now you've got to make a quick decision. What do we do? How do we handle these things? We could say this is very basic for us, but at the same time, there's a lot of depth that can come if you really dig in and think about how we can make those changes that are necessary so we can make it through the temptation. In 1 Timothy chapter 10 and verse 13, Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, he's trying to give them hope about the temptations that they face and the challenges that they face. In verse 13 it says, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it." Now, we give God the credit for helping us through the temptation, and he deserves the credit. He's given us everything that we need for life and godliness, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3. He's taught us how to do these things. He's given us examples of people that faced temptation and overcame, and also examples of people who faced temptations and didn't overcome. We can learn a tremendous amount. We need to recognize, though, that when we're facing temptation, while God is the one who sees us through, it's based upon the decisions that we make in the process. He's not going to force you to do what is right. He will never take away your decision-making ability and say, you know what, you're just not going to have this. I'm going to see you through it no matter what. And that's a dangerous thought to tell yourself, that it doesn't matter what you're tempted by, you know God will see you through it. Yes, he will see you through it, but it does matter how you decide, what you decide to do with the temptation that's there. Those two things cannot be separated. We're going to see an example of this in Genesis chapter 4 when we get there in just a minute. But I wanted to go through very quickly and recognize the process of sin. This is James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. And there's a lot more that could be said here. I'm just going to be touching the surface of what he's talking about here, but I want to encourage you to continue to think about this and see how it applies in your own life. But look in verse. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires. Then it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. And then he ends it by saying, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren." We need to be careful and recognize what this process is if we have any hope of overcoming it. So look at what he says here happens. First, we're drawn away. This is the idea of enticing. In fact, it says entice. The word entice there is a word that is a hunting term. It's a word that is It means to lure someone away or to lure an animal into a trap with a lure, right? So it could be fishing, you throw a lure out and the fish sees a shiny object and they go and attack it. It could be an animal that is, there's maybe food in a snare and they walk into that. That's the idea. They're entrapped, they're enticed, and they're brought to this place. And he says we're enticed by our own desires. And in fact, he starts in verse 13. He says, don't say you're tempted by God when you're tempted. God's not the one who's tempting you. You're enticed by the things that you enjoy, the things that you want. And there are a lot of reasons why we might be enticed. It could be that we have a need that's a legitimate need that God has put in within us. You know, for example, we all have the need to eat, right? There's nothing wrong with being tempted to eat some steak or to eat a pie. There's nothing wrong with the temptation. It's how we respond to it that's important. And we have to recognize that those things are tempting to you because that's part of what you like, right? There's some people that are tempted to eat liver and onions. I can't imagine wanting to eat liver and onions. I will if I have to. I'm not going to be seeking it out, right? Sin is that way. You're tempted toward things based upon personality, based upon your past, based upon all kinds of things. We can get into psychology, which I don't know much about. The Bible doesn't say much about. But it is true that we are enticed by things that we desire. One of the things that we can ask is, why do I desire this? It could be because it's a natural thing that God has put within us. God has given us desires, and those desires are not evil in and among themselves, but they can be twisted. They can be turned. We can start craving things that are not wholesome, that are not good for us, and a lot of that has to do with our past, the way we think about things, which is not the point of the lesson this morning. But in James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, we're drawn away, we're enticed. And then it says, when desire has conceived, in verse 15. The idea of conception there is literally conceived. I think of it in a way like we have a concept. We have a thought that comes into our mind. We've conceived this idea of how we're going to accomplish what we want. And all of us have been there. Anytime we sin, it's either because we've reasoned through it in the past of how we're going to accomplish it, and so we just kind of do the same thing we did in the past, or else we're in such a moment, it's in the moment, and we just grab at whatever we can find. But there is some process in our brain that says, I need to figure out how I'm going to do this. So when someone cuts us off, we want to yell and scream at them in traffic and maybe ride their bumper and all kinds of stuff like that. We're doing that for a reason. We want to get back at them. We want to show them up or whatever it is. We've got this thought of how we're going to do that. And so we act sometimes very foolish. But it all relates to either the way we're trying to accomplish it or what we're thinking is going to happen when we do these things. And it's always going to be, we think it's the best. We think it's the easiest way to accomplish what we need to have accomplished. And taking those shortcuts is one of the easiest ways to fall into sin. And looking at things the way that God does not describe them, it's opposite of what God says in reality in the Word. These thought processes are what get us into the most trouble. We conceive, then that comes from the pleasures and the desires that we have. And then it says that it gives birth. It gives birth to sin. Just because you have a thought about sin doesn't mean necessarily that you're sinning. But if it leads to that, it's born. That is, you're actively doing something now that you know to be wrong, or maybe you don't realize it's wrong at the time. The conception leads to birth, and then he says when birth is full grown, it brings forth death. That means there's a process of growth. It's not immediate necessarily, and it may not be physical death, but it is spiritual. But the growth really, really stands out to me, because have you ever noticed that it's rare that you sin and the sin is isolated and it never impacts anyone else or anything else? Sin usually involves other people in some way or another. It usually involves even more sins. It takes you places you never thought you were going to go. It causes you to do things you never thought would happen. For example, if you tell someone a lie, you may have to tell another lie to back up that lie. And then someone may confront you, and there may be anger issues, or maybe fighting. There are all kinds of things that can happen because you did one thing. And we all can look at our past lives and see, if I wouldn't have done this one thing, all these other things may not have happened as a result from it. But sin brings about more sin. And then that brings ultimately death. That's obviously what we want to avoid. Now, the great thing about the gospel is it teaches us this pathway in the world around us, the secular world. The scientific community believes that there is no free will, that we can't make decisions, that we're just pre-programmed as part of our genetic nature. If we are drawn away and enticed, it's because we have this desire that's built in, and it is inevitable. You're going to do the thing, whatever it is. And so there's some people in extremes who would say people who child molesters, murderers, that's just part of who they are. They can't help it. The great news about the gospel is that the gospel teaches us we can interfere at any point in that process. We don't have to wait until we're dead or dying to seek help. We can interfere in the process of Satan, in the process of sin and death, at any point along the way, if we recognize it. And that's the only hope we have, is a recognition. We're going to look at that today in the book of Genesis chapter 4. And this is actually the first murder with Cain and Abel. It's important. I thought about, there's so many ways we could go with this. There's so many examples in the Bible of people that did the wrong thing, right? But we can look at this, and I want you to notice that there's a place in here where there's an attempt to interrupt that, and God is teaching them a lesson about the interruption process. And I want you to read with me verses 1 through 12. It said, Adam knew his wife, Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain and said, I've acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering. But he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you. You should rule over it. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother. It came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. The Lord said to Cain, where's Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? He said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me and from the ground. So now you're cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. Now, this is the account, as we said, Cain and Abel both offered sacrifices to God. In Hebrews chapter 11, it tells us that Abel offered a sacrifice in faith. That is, he did what God expected for him to do. Faith is the recognition of what God says, trusting him to do it his way. And so because he believed God, he offered what God expected. It doesn't say that the reason he was accepted and was because of what he offered. It was the fact that he offered what God wanted to happen. So here Cain is offering, it says that Cain was a tiller of the ground in verse 2, and some people say, well, the reason he was rejected is because he offered up vegetables. It doesn't. We can assume that. It doesn't say it, though. In fact, we can look in the Old Testament, and God received vegetable offerings at times. In fact, it was part of the law of Moses. They could offer first fruits to God. That was expected of them. So what we do know is that whatever he did, the reason that failed was because he didn't do it in faith. He didn't do it trusting God. Maybe it was inferior. Maybe it was God told him to get a goat, and he didn't get one. We don't know. But what we do know is that he was not accepted by God. His offering was not accepted. That, by the way, is a really important idea. The religious world around us tells us it doesn't matter what you do in worship to God because he accepts everything. But it's never been the case. He always tells us how to approach him. But we have verses 3 through 5 that it's talking about this inappropriate anger. There's an indicator that something is off. Something is wrong because of the anger that's... Could you imagine him coming to the point of killing someone because he's so angry. And if you think about what transpired, you would think that that wouldn't be as big a deal as he made it. Verses 3 through 5, though, it says, Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering. He did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. There's an indication of something going on in his mind that's wrong, that's off. And in fact, if you think about it, if Cain would have been soberly thinking, the first question might be, what did I do that my brother didn't do? Or what did my brother do that I didn't do so that I can also be accepted by God? But it wasn't the question he asked. The immediate reaction he has is he's angry. And he's not angry at God. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say he's angry at himself. He's angry at his brother. How do we know that? Because he killed a man over it. We have inappropriate anger. Then we have verses 6 and 7 as a warning. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? God is trying to interrupt the process. We have here already a man who is on a pathway towards sin. He hadn't committed sin yet. He's angry. He's reacted. He's being enticed by something. Depends on who you ask as far as, why he would be so angry. It could be because he didn't like the fact that his brother was showing him up. It could be the fact that he's jealous because his brother had something that he wanted, and so he thought, well, the best way to do that is just kill my brother. Don't know. But he's angry about this situation, and God steps in and gives him a warning, and he says, why are you angry? This should make him think, why is he angry? I used to have a problem with being a hothead when I was little. And the best way to handle a hothead for yourself, if you're a hothead, is to take a breath, take a step back, and ask, why are you angry? What's so bad about this situation? And a lot of times, if we'll just think for a minute, we might realize that, okay, maybe we have a reason to be upset, but it doesn't mean that we have to be, right? It doesn't mean that we have to go to extremes. God steps in, makes him think, why is your countenance fallen? That kind of is an indication, maybe depression. He's sad because he doesn't have what he wanted to have. And then in verse 7, he said, if you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. The obvious answer for him was simply, just do what's right. That would have solved everything. The next time there was an offering to be made, Cain presents his offering to the Lord, and he's accepted just like Abel is, and they both celebrate, and they're happy, and everybody gets along, and nobody kills anyone. But that's not what happened. That wasn't acceptable. He had this desire now that's starting to grow, and this desire is to be better than, or to be superior to, evidently, to his brother. And God says to him, don't you know if you just do what's right, it'll be okay? But if you don't do well, sin lies at the door. That is, it's right there waiting for you. You can open the door or not. It's there. And it said, its desire is for you. It wants you. Here's God warning him, hey, I know where this is headed. You need to stop and think about where it's headed. If you just do what's right, it's going to be okay. But here's the sin that is there. It's desires for you. And he says, but you should rule over it. You've got to take control of yourself. So he gives him the warning. And then we have the conception and the birth in verse 8. Knowing what God said, Cain talked with Abel, his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel and his brother and killed him. Why? Because his desire came to full fruition. He had the idea, I'm just going to take care of this. I'll kill my brother. I don't know if it was the heat of the moment, if they had an argument. It doesn't say. But what it does say is that God warned him, this is the path you're on. You need to overcome this temptation because sin is at the door and it wants you. There's no way we can avoid looking at ourselves like that. Sin at the door. It's always right there. You have the option of whether you open the door or not. But he conceived this idea, and it could have been a long process. where he thought, I'm going to wait till the right opportunity and then I'm going to kill him. Or it could have been in the heat of the moment, he just picked up something and hit him with it. We don't know. Doesn't say what he killed him with. It just said he killed him. Rose up against him. All because his brother received some praise that he didn't. Wow. See how it's easy to go to extremes when our emotions get involved and we stop thinking rationally and clearly. The easiest and best thing he could have done was completely ignored. And he did the worst thing that he could imagine. Killed his brother because God liked his offering more than Cain's. It's sad. We've all been in places like that, though. Then we see the growth of it in verse 9, because not only is he now had killed his brother, but he's now going to start denying it. I don't know what you're talking about. Didn't so far in those words, but the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The implication is, he's not my responsibility. The word keeper there is actually a word that refers to animals being kept in a pen. I'm not his trainer. I'm not his caretaker. What do I care where he is? Why do you think God was asking that question? Because he knew exactly what had happened. He knew that he'd just killed Abel. And so Cain has the perfect opportunity to fess up, to talk about what he had done and say, I'm sorry I did this and I got overwhelmed, but he didn't. He just pretended he didn't know where he was. Cain knew exactly where he was because he's the one who left the body where he left it. He knew exactly where Abel was. And he said to him in verse 10, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now we have the punishment phase that comes in. God knows what we do. You know, it's so strange that we all tend to think that we can get away with things. He won't ever know. We do things in secret. We do things in dark rooms. We do things behind the scenes. Nobody has any idea. And the only person we're lying to is ourselves. Jesus even said the fact that those who, whisper secrets, those things will be exalted one day. Everyone will know. And God knows. The judgment will come. Everyone's going to know what we've done. And we think, if I just hide enough, I can hide even from God. But He's there. He knows exactly what's going on. And we need to recognize that. That helps us. I used to think that I had a kind of a paranoia. It's like, God's watching my every move. And I've known people that took that to an extreme that said, I can't do anything because God's watching everything that I do. And He's just waiting to pounce on judgment. That's not the idea. An all-seeing eye to some people's paranoia thing where they're scared. I can't believe that God would be, and so we have to be perfect. That's not the point. God sees, though. We need to use that as a catalyst for ourselves to remind ourselves to be responsible for the things that we believe, the things that we think, the conceptions, the concepts that we have in our head and where they're leading to. We need to be very careful because God knows what's happening but even before we do it. We have the punishment phase. That is exactly what James said was going to happen. And we face this reality ourselves. We've said so many times. We have godly desires. I believe wholeheartedly that we're created without sin, that we're not born in sin. Psalm 51 talks about David said, I was born in iniquity. In iniquity my mother conceived me. That's talking about the process when he was conceived, perhaps. Maybe his mother was a sinner, but it's not talking about himself, except for the fact as a metaphor for what he had done. He had just committed sin with Bathsheba. Not just that. It grew into even more where murder was involved and all kinds of lying and cover-ups and all kinds of political things are going on. And he's repenting to God, and he's using this as figurative language to say, just look at how terrible I am. I must have been conceived in sin. That's how terrible he felt about himself. But the Bible tells us that we come to a point in our age when we actually become guilty before God, when we can understand the processes. So a baby who is born cannot sin. There's nothing they can do that's sinful. But we can. And the older we grow, the more we learn about sin, the more we learn how to do it. We learn how to sin, and we take these desires that God gives to us that are godly at the heart, and we corrupt them, and we twist them to things that we shouldn't do. Romans chapter 1 and verse 28 is an example of that. And he tells us here about the people, the Gentiles, who went away from God. And there's a lot that's going on here. In verse 18, it says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. And he tells all the process of how that all happened. And down in verse 28, it says, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. The idea here of a debased mind means one that is corrupted. It's been changed. It's been altered from what God intended from the original purpose. God creates us with goodness, and our desires are even good things because they're made for us to seek for Him, to seek the things that we need for life, and we twist them over time. They get twisted, sometimes by pain, sometimes by our own sins, sometimes by the way we think that we have to make changes in what God said and start thinking the way we want to change, want to think, all kinds of reasons for that. But our reality is the fact that we can take our desires that are good and wholesome, and we can corrupt them so we desire things that are wrong. Well, the way to fix that would be to go ask yourself about your desires. Why is it that this is attractive to me? Is it a godly desire, or is it something that I've corrupted and changed? You know, the good thing about that is if you corrupt them, you can also change them back. I have a firm belief that we can control the things that we like. You know, some of us did that with food. Have you ever had something you didn't like, but you made yourself learn to eat it? I have. There's this stuff called kefir. I never ran into it until I was in Russia, and I thought it was a Russian thing only, but there's some here. It's basically buttermilk that's more buttery, more disgusting. And they loved it over there. They drank it all the time. I said, I'm going to learn how to drink that. And I would put it in a small little, I'd put that much in a glass, and I would have a sip every day. And before long, I started craving that stuff. It was good. I hated it at first. You can change the things that you desire. But it's hard. It takes work. And so most of us just throw up our hands and say, I can't help it. It's who I am. But the gospel, God's power that to save you, part of that gospel process is you learning new tastes. And you'll get there. We also have this idea of warped desires again. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 is what we started with. He will not give you a temptation beyond what you can handle. And this, as I've said, this is a double-edged sword. It's wonderful for us because we can have confidence when we're facing a temptation. We can say, I know I'm going to make it through this if I just put my trust in God and do it His way and make sure I'm thinking the correct ways. He will help me through this. In fact, that's what He says. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape. Now notice that. He didn't say He's going to carry you through it. He said, what is He going to do? He's going to, understanding who you are, He's going to give you a way of escape. And the question is, are you looking for that way of escape? That's the question. Because a lot of times we enter in temptation and we realize we're being tempted, and we're not trying to find the way out of it. We're trying to find a way to justify it. We're trying to find a way to make ourselves feel better about it. There's the double-edged sword. And here's a point for us to think about. Anytime you face temptation, you have the opportunity to avoid sin if you interrupt that process. But every time you sin, it's because you had the opportunity to choose something different, but refused to. That hurts. And that means that every one of us, when we sin, it's because we decided not to look to that way of escape. Why do I say that? Not so that we all go away feeling guilty, but so that you can make a decision next time you face it, I'm going to look for that way of escape. It's there waiting for us, right? And no, you're not going to be perfect. Nobody's perfect. But we need to do the best that we can. When we see this temptation, we see it as an opportunity to do one thing, an opportunity to glorify God by finding that way of escape that He promised. And sometimes Satan will do everything he can to hide that thing, but it's there. And if you look hard enough, you'll find it. This is what we can understand. James chapter 1 and verse 13 will help us bring this to an end. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He Himself tempt anyone. I'm so happy that God does not tempt people to sin. You know, there's no indication in the Bible that Satan can read minds. It doesn't say that. It's possible that he can, but it doesn't say that he does. I know the things that I say or the things that I do will give him indication of the things that I enjoy, and maybe he can play in on that. But it does say to God, He knows everything about us. He knows our strengths and our weaknesses. And could you imagine if God wanted to tempt you, how good at it He would be? Wow. But He doesn't want you to fail. He wants you to succeed. So He doesn't offer the temptation. That's between us and Satan, really. And now we have to make the decision. What are we going to do? We need to take ownership of our own selves. That's what the idea is. You need to master your temptations before they master you. And the end result of that is death. Romans chapter 7 teaches us that as human beings looking to serve God, we have this problem. We want to do what is right. We want to be with God and have this pure relationship between us, but there's something in the way. It's our own sin. And we do everything in the world to get rid of that sin, but it's still there. And what I want to accomplish, a relationship with God, is not what I accomplish at all. In fact, what I end up accomplishing is I'm just dying. Because I got in the way. My sin got in the way. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through Jesus Christ, who gives us the remission of our sins and the hope that He will continually cleanse us from the sin that we will find ourselves involved in the future. If there's any way we can help you today, we're here for you. If you need prayers of the church, you need to be added to the assembly. If there's anything that you need to be baptized for the remission of your sins, any way we can help, please come as we stand and sing.